by recognizing the land on which we are today. But also for somebody who is a chief, I'm a traditional chief in Ghana. I think the land is so important to me for the teachings of the land, but also for the spiritual guidance that it gives us in our work. So I do want to recognize that. But also somebody who has been accepted, being welcomed by the indigenous peoples of this land. I think it's very important for us to recognize that. Now, we also recognize the land to acknowledge the ancestors and the elders who are here with us, but also absent spiritually, I think, physically or emotionally. I think it's very, very important to do that. I also want to thank Karen for the invitation to be here. My last visit here was about, I think, in April when I gave the keynote address for the Metropolis conference that was held here, the national conference. I got to tell you this. I come to this discussion as a sociologist, and those of us who are trained in sociology, I'm sure some of you are here. We have to work with two lanes, right? One is we question, but it's not only the questioning. We also do what is called the visionary, the what ought to be. So it's not just the what is and criticize, but also the what ought to be. So I'll be operating from those two modes. Now, my primary interest, I mean, as Karen was saying, as somebody who is interested in questions of transformation, is how we pursue educational resistance to be able to talk about a new global futurity. And so my scholarship in this case has to matter in terms of who I am, where I am, and what I do. And I think to me, when I look, for example, when we look at our current society, there are many issues I can pick on. But for me, for example, when we look at Black Lives Matter, what they stand for, and the issues that they are dealing with today, my scholarship has to matter in terms of asking us to think critically about our society and how we work to improve the society that we find ourselves in. So it's very, very important for me to ask a question like, how do we co-produce knowledge with our communities in order for educational transformation to be possible, and not just educational transformation, but also the question of social change? That question to me is very, very important. So I want to begin with some words of caution, and this is from one of my doctoral students at the University of Toronto, and it's because I teach on Fanon. And in one of the papers that she wrote, I picked this quote from her, where she says, it is not important that everyone agrees with Fanon. So it's not important that you agree with me. That's not the issue. What is more important is that what I'm saying gives you a pedagogical foundation to interrogate, to decolonize, to reconstruct ourselves, our beliefs, and our supposed normalities, unquote. And that is Margaret Brimpon, who's a PhD student at the University of Toronto. But as Karen was also saying, one of the things that I've been quoted very often is this idea that any community is as good as we collectively work to make it. This is our collective responsibility. Nobody is going to create the communities for us. We create them, right? And it's as good as we collectively work to make it. But let us also remember, we are all doing political work for change. That sometimes the work we do, we shouldn't expect immediate gratification. I think as the Kiambu of Kenya say, the starter is not always beneficiary. Let's think of the future generation. Let's think of the young ones. Let's think about those who are yet unborn and how we create that new futurity that will make it possible for them to realize that those who went before us laid the foundation on which we stand. And that is so important. There are definitely some long-standing issues of education, schooling education, that I'm sure some of you are grappling with, right? We talk about the systemic challenges and the particular impacts on indigenous bodies, racialized bodies, and other marginalized students, particularly when it comes to the question of success. For example, the absence of physical representation, that they go into school, they don't see teachers who look like them, they don't see bodies who look like them. The curriculum is not that sophisticated enough to address the complexity of the issues that affect us. We also have to deal with the ongoing negations and the absences in what in 1997 we used the deep curriculum, which is the social organizational life of schools. The absences, the negations. Where are the other Canadians? Where are the other bodies to ask those questions and to deal with them critically? Then also the whole issue of youth disengagement. You can have students who are physically present in school, but they are absent in mind and soul. And we use the word push out. It's not that a teacher will hold their hand and say, go walk out. But the messages that are sent, so the students definitely think they want to be the way anti-black racism, for example, also plays out in our society today. Right? Then also the whole issue about what I call the discursive manipulations. And one of it is where the whole notion of intellectual gymnastics. We play on words, right? So schools should take credit for success. And I think educators, we should. If my students succeed, I'm very proud of that. Right? But if you're going to take credit for success, we should be prepared to accept responsibility for failures. Don't blame somebody else. Don't blame the families. Don't pathologize the families and the communities. If we take the credit for success, let's accept the responsibility for the failures and deal with that, the problems. And then the dominant conceptions of success. You know, sometimes we work with learners who think they are good in school, or it's because of their individual effort. They don't look at the communities that they are part of, the communities of learners that have contributed to their success. And that is part of the dominant conceptions of success. The hard work. Well, I'm good because I'm hard working, right? Not look at the environment, not look at the teachers who contributed to make that success possible. And then also the whole issue about the neoliberalism and the educational agenda. Current talk of neoliberalism actually is scripting the way we talk about education. So there's a deliberate deployment of the language of neoliberal educational reforms, things like standards. You hear it all the time. Equity, accountability, excellence, competencies, quality, all framed within the human capital paradigm. And I think there's that deliberate. I don't have any problems if we talk about this in a way that is very, very critical. It leads to transformation. But if it only reproduces the status quo, I think we have to have a problem and deal with that. And then schooling in the context of global capitalist modernity, where there's the discipline of bodies in terms of education that serves individualized private corporate market interests. We talk about the role of, look, corporations want to come into schooling and education. When they come there, okay, they ask, what are you going to get back? So they want to bring their Coke machine in to sell this Coke, right? What about the fiscal implications, the health implications for our students? Right. I think it's very, very important to be able to raise these questions. And then the dialectic of coloniality and modernity and how they have worked to ensure the hegemony of Western science knowledge. I'm here talking about the absence of multicentricity. Karen's earlier talk was about the issue of multicentricity, how we create a space for multiple voices, multiple experiences, multiple histories to be heard in that context. And then what Kejeti, the indigenous scholar, talks about multi-epistemes. There are different ways of reading the world. I'm speaking to you in a different way. It doesn't mean I'm right, you are wrong. But that voice has to be heard to create that space for the multiplicity of voices to be heard. And then, for example, also the seductive liberal notion of inclusion, right? Where we run it off. When we depoliticize difference, difference is about power. Inclusion is dealing with the question of power. We have to challenge what Lewin talks about, the standardization recipes. And Bell Hooks a long time ago says, sameness is a provocation that terrorizes. The idea of one size fits all. That sameness is a provocation that terrorizes. And we need to challenge that in that context. Now, what discursive positions am I taking in my address to you? The first is, as somebody who is an anti-colonial thinker, right? I raise the issue that our anti-colonial intellectuality, in terms of our politics of decolonization, must consider the body of the knowledge producer. Who is producing the body, at what context, within what movement? And what are the desires that the body has? And what are the politics that we want to pursue when we produce this knowledge? So that's one discursive position that I take in my address. The second is that the pursuit of anti-colonial, anti-racist, or even issues of feminist discourses is intimately connected with decolonization. And by extension, decolonization cannot happen solely through Western science scholarship. That's a fact. Western science scholarship is important, but decolonization needs more than that. That is because Western science scholarship has been part of the problem. The coloniality of science, it has been part of the problem. So if we want to decolonize, then we have to introduce our students to a wide field of knowledges. It cannot just be Western science. We have to talk about the multiple ways of knowing if you want to decolonize. Because Western science has been hegemonic, it has been part of the problem because of the coloniality of science. I don't need to tell you. History is constructed by the dominant, right? And it's part of the coloniality that I'm talking about in this sense. And then the agency of taking up literacy education, which I'm sure many of you here are doing, through a critical perspective of social justice and decolonial practice as key to achieving academic and social success for contemporary learners. In other words, the whole issue of pursuing equity, literacy as both an intellectual and political act. Right? Political act in the sense that we want to change, we want to transform. That we look at what is happening, and when somebody says, I don't play politics, that's precisely politics. To say you don't have politics, have politics. That is it. So there's nothing apolitical. We are, and we must be honest, bring that intellectual honesty to that. Now, I think if you want to talk about these issues about literacy education and what it means for questions of difference, we have to start with the issues around globalization and education and the link, right? So first of all, we have to be careful or we have to understand the critiques of the global publics. And this is something that we all talk about, right? Which is an emerging transnationally organized global public, which is very, very critical of globalization and the way it has intensified global inequities, questions of poverty, and the fact that globalization has worked differently in terms of its benefits for different communities. The benefits for the global north are not the same for the global south, and we need to be aware of that. Then also this whole idea of the hegemony of free markets, deregulation, competition, individualism, privatization, and a restrictive this definition of education that only serves corporate market interests. It's about pursuing the rights of the global capital. I think we need to be very, very critical of this in that sense too. But also to be aware of some of the specific impacts and also the implications for schooling and education. So we take the whole question of education for global diversity. What does it mean? The question of social difference and what it means for education and delivery. If you are serious about social difference, what does it mean for education and delivery? So questions of teaching, learning, and administration of education. Social difference is about gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, language, culture. What do this mean for transforming our schools, or what does it mean for education and delivery? Does this also mean for the cultural politics of schooling? The contestations about knowledge, whose experiences get count, whose knowledge is validated, whose histories are legitimized. These questions become something to raise. And then also the question of navigating culture in a new space, in a new place. What some have called the bifurcated regimes of citizenship, for example. Like we have citizens who have rights, and then those who are subjects who need to be governed. I think when we look at it, it's very, very clear in terms of when somebody says law and order in the States, when Donald Trump talked about the issue about law and order, it's about what? Subjects who are to be governed. It's not about the question of citizenship with rights. Because if it's about citizenship with rights, then you talk about the fact that as citizens, then they have a right to live, they have a right to survive, and that they cannot be shot, they cannot be brutalized without a voice being raised in that context. And all this is part of the dictates. This bifurcation is part of the dictates of capitalist citizenship. Then of integration of new migrants, dealing with alienation. This is something that we are still dealing with. We are still dealing with, because Canada is always welcoming new migrants. So we have to address the problem of dealing with alienation, their devalued identity, and the social exclusion or racialized exclusions. We have to deal with that. And then the crisis, what we call refugee crisis at the moment, challenges of racialized and gendered poverty, homelessness and displacement as non-status refugees, some of the post-traumatic stress that they have to go through because they are coming from war-torn or war zones, and how discrimination in housing and other social service sector affects people's sense of belonging. When I ask the question of who is the Canadian, where are the other Canadians? I'm talking about this sense of belonging. The fact that some of us always get asked, where are you from, George? If my son was born here, where is your dad from? If his dad was here, where is his great-grandparent? There's always this constant search to place somebody somewhere else. So we always have to deal with this sense of belonging, the tensions around that in that context. Then, of course, something we are all concerned with, global terrorism, right? But it's not just global terrorism, but also the state-sanctioned violence in the fragile state of the world. Extremism is highly current global concern, we all agree, because of the links with terrorism, religious extremism, but not just that, also racial bigotry. We see that play out, particularly in the States at the moment. But Canada is not innocent. So we cannot constantly juxtapose ourselves with the US. There's always a constant, it's worse in the US, but good here. No, we can't do that. I think we have to recognize that this is something which is something for all of us to deal with. So the question is, how can education help counter forms of extremism in this case, which present danger to societies globally? Preventing youth from joining extremist groups, enabling youth to critically analyze extremism and its consequences. as people like Lee Davis write about, and also helping youth deal with the sense of nihilism. Look, we have many youth, despite their creative potentials, despite their skills, they are dealing with this sense of nihilism, a sense of living a dead-end existence, sense of lost hope, lost dreams taken away from them. And how do we, if you want to talk about education in a way that is transformative, deal with some of these issues of our youth? There are obviously possibilities. And I think this is where, for example, those who write and talk about global education, global citizenship education, there are possibilities. I think we all know global education in terms of dealing with issues about global interdependence, the commitment to fundamental rights and freedoms of peoples, tolerance of intercultural differences, something that we have all heard, and they believe in the efficacy and power of the individual action. That's good. I think, but we need to be also critical of the pursuit of global citizenship education in this case. How does it deal with concretely with questions of power and privilege? Questions of power and privilege. And how do we see our relative complicities in sustaining colonial and oppressive education and the ensuing global structural inequities? Also, we have to ask, are there any redemptive qualities? Because I think, to me, we need to be critical to poach some of the strengths of this type of education. So what are the redemptive qualities of global education that can be pursued? And to ask what critical frameworks and practices will help us disrupt the asymmetrical power relations that we have to deal with in our society continually. Right? And then, sure, education. I think today we all talk about education and we see the potential. We see the possibilities of education. But education is pursued today as a core avenue for global redistributive justice. I think this is something we need to look critically at it. And in my work in Africa, for example, I'm sometimes amazed about how Karen talk about democracy, good governance, human rights. They are all intertwined with education, that only if we have education that we have the good governance and that, right? The problem, though, is that that education is presented within the prism of what? The primacy of the markets and global capital, and that becomes a problem, right? Because, as I said, the interest of global capital always reigns supreme in that sense. So framing literacy education, and here I'm sure many of you have raised these issues. I think moving literacy education from knowing how to read and write, whether in maths, science, social studies, English, etc., to engaging learning as a process of sharing, reciprocity, respect, collaboration, healing, creating sustainable relationship. I just read a piece by Karen and Pierce that basically raised some of these questions. Also, pursuing literacy education not as an end in itself, but as a process and a movement of transitioning in life for the learner to be critical of his or her environment. This notion about being critical, right? What I'm getting here is, for example, how do we reward resistance? Most of us here punish resistance. We should reward resistance. Transformation will only come through resistance. Through resistance, we sow the seeds of our own decolonization, and we must reward it. We can only reward it if we allow our learners to be critical of their environments, to ask the tough questions, to bring the questions that we put under the carpet, under the sink, to bring it to the fore. The questions we don't want to ask because it destabilizes us. It makes us complicit. It makes us what? Complacent. And it destabilizes that. We need to ask those tough questions. Then situating inclusivity as an important aspect of literacy education. The idea of beginning, you see this inclusivity I'm talking about is radical inclusion. You know, one of the things that I've been quoted for is this idea that how do you talk about bringing about change when you include to what already exists? When that which already exists is the source of the problem in the first place. That which already exists is the source of the problem, and you just want to add to it. What are you doing? You are just reproducing, recycling, right? So we begin anew. This is where those of us who talk about the Afrocentric school, right, are coming up. That look, if we want to continue to simply say inclusion, it becomes so liberal, and we only reproduce it. So let's begin anew and think creatively about new ideas, new things. And this is where some of us come from. So we talk about the Afrocentric school, not in terms of who goes there, but the ideas that propel the school. The ideas of reciprocity, community, mutual interdependence. The fact that we are each other's keeper. That if your child is doing well in school and my child is not doing well, it is our responsibility. It's not their responsibility. That notion, to work with it. And then validating a critical teaching of difference as about power, about recognition, about validation, about distance. And it's also about decolonization. through resistance, we sow the seeds of our own decolonization. And to see equity literacy as about key principles of social responsibility, power, accountability, transparency, ethics, and social justice. These are key words for us to be working with. We should not be afraid to engage them because they do help us to talk about transformation. And then to see that the most effective equity literacy approach is one which is integrative. It's also interdisciplinary and it's holistic in its outlook. That racial equity literacy is strategic instruction about the saliency of race and its intensities of difference. So issues about gender, disability, class, sexuality, which is to say it's not just all about race, but how these sides of difference, right, are intersected. So the intensities of difference in this case. And then to deal with the impacts, possibilities, and challenges of digital literacy practice in an inclusive classroom environment. I think this issue is very important because of the way our world is moving, that we are moving into the age of technology, and digital technology is very, very important. People see the potential, the possibilities. But I think if you're also serious, we have to be very, very critical and look at not only the impact, the possibilities, but also the challenges, right? If you want to use it in our schools to transform and to deal with some of the issues I'm talking about. So towards decolonized literacy education, there are certain things that I just want to spell out. One is the whole notion of decolonization. I think we need to be very, very clear. What are we talking about here? As many have written, there are many parts to decolonization. The whole point, though, is that decolonization is always violent. The reason why it's violent is that decolonization and subverts the status quo. They are vested interests. And therefore, it's not easy to talk about decolonization. You're going to be seen as the rabble-rouser, the troublemaker, the one who wants to upset the apple cart, right? Everything is fine and dandy. What do we want to do? Change, right? So to deal with that. And that is not also an arrival, but an ongoing process. I've never seen anybody who is decolonized. We all have to do it, continually do it. It's like we continually have to do it, right? And that's Linda Smith, the Aboriginal scholar, talks about, quote, it engages with imperialism and colonialism at multiple levels. But it's also, decolonization is not about mainstreaming practice. If you mainstream the practice, it's not a decolonized practice, because decolonization appends, it subverts mainstream. So if you are simply mainstreaming, it's not a decolonizing project. In other words, decolonization projects cannot seek for legitimacy and validation from the dominant, right? And those of us who talk about counter-epistemologies, we are always amazed how people say, well, they critique the epistemologies we put forward, and when you look critically, they are using dominant lenses to interrogate the epistemologies that we put forward. That is not decolonization, right? And then also to say that decolonization is about developing a critical consciousness of self. All the things we're talking about start with the self. Where we are, where we find ourselves, the entry point, the place, the history, the identity that we bring, the culture and the politics, and memories that we bring to the work that we do in this context. Also, the question of the land. I started by recognizing the land. I think it's very, very important. We have to teach our students precisely about the land on which they are. It's very, very important, what it means, right? But decolonization cannot just be simply about the land. I think the land is a key starting point to talk about decolonization. But we also have to talk about decolonization in a very complex ways, that it includes issues about the psyche, cultural memories, internalization of colonial relations of thought and power, and recognizing the diverse experiences of peoples who conceptualize the land differently for transnational anti-colonial politics. Well, here what I'm trying to get at is, when we look at the question of language, for example, language is a key site for decolonization, right? Some of us have to deal with the colonial language. But talk about decolonization in terms of multiple languages, it's about resistance. It is about resistance. In Guji, I think a long time ago, talked about growing up in Kenya, where if he spoke his indigenous language, there was a cost to do that, right? That basically he had to speak the dominant language. Well, I'm not talking about substituting one with the other. I'm talking about the multiple languages, helping our students engage the multiple languages. Right? In Toronto, for example, I go into parents' home and I say, teach them our local language. And they say, well, George, we want them to be a professor like you, so they should learn the English, right? And I'm saying, no, they can learn the English, but they should also keep up with the indigenous language. It is actually strength and success, right? But it's again the way we've been caught up and brought up to think differently in that. And I think the point here about also the land is also to recognize that decolonization is not just for, quote, the other. The dominant needs to decolonize just as the other himself or herself needs to decolonize in that say. And then decolonization and transgressive pedagogies. That decolonization, as we all know, is a political intellectual art. It begins by asking new critical questions. There's a scholar at York University, Debbie Brisman. She talks about destabilizing knowledge. Destabilizing knowledge is a knowledge that sits uncomfortably with us because we ask the tough questions. We ask the critical questions. That's what brings change. The questions we don't want to ask. It deals with our sense of complacency, right? And shakes us to think. And also to recognize, as I said, that decolonization cannot happen solely through Western science scholarship. And to think that there are particular places for indigenous epistemologists because they add to the way we read our world, to threaten, to challenge, to replace and reimagine alternatives to colonial thinking and practice. That the complex problems facing our world today cannot be dealt with simply through universalist solutions. However, they can be remedied by multicentric ways of doing, knowing, acting. And that's about decolonization in that sense. So what do I mean when I say asking new questions? There are some questions that I think we should deal with. How do we frame an inclusive anti-colonial global future? How do we frame an inclusive anti-colonial global future? And what is the nature of the work that is required to collectively arrive at that future? What is the nature of the work that is required? What sort of education should be taking place in our schools today? And what are we going to do with our education as learners? We are all learners. Even if you're a teacher, you're a learner. What are we going to do with that education? And then how do we refashion our roles, whether as students, learners, educators, and community workers, to create more relevant understandings of what it means to be human? Right? What it means to be human. The questions of sharing, respect, reciprocity, mutual interdependence, that we are all in this together. That if your child is doing well and my child is not doing well, it is not George's problem. It is our problem. That is, to me, talking about the new way of being human. That relationality, right? That concern for each other. How do we equip ourselves with multiple lenses of critical inquiry? Multiple lenses of critical inquiry. No one tells the full story. George is not telling the full story. Karen is not telling the full story. Stephen is not telling this. Fatima is not telling the full story. But how do we tell multiple stories in order to get the whole story out? It's one thing about the multicentricity. And then how do we bring a humility of knowing to our work, whether as teachers, whether as students? How do we bring a humility to our work? It is very, very important. So new framings of diversity, and I think we need to, if we want to talk about these issues, I think we have to work with some new framings of diversity, difference, and social inclusion. And here quickly, I would just want to put 5 core philosophical principles and standpoints on these new framings. The first is to think through the politics of identity and knowledge. Who we are as a people, as a community, who we are. How do we come to know, understand, and act within our worlds? Because these are all connected. Secondly, acknowledging the relative saliencies of our different identities. That when we talk about saliency, it's not a privilege. It's not a hierarchy. But I'm talking about the relative saliencies. That, for example, to be a black body and to be a white body, there's a saliency in that, and to recognize that. So to recognize the severity of issues for certain bodies and certain communities. It's not that saying all communities are facing hardship. Yes, they are. But some communities are facing some salient hardships, and we need to recognize that. That, to me, is working with this notion of the politics of identity and knowledge in that. The second is cultivating diverse communities. And here I'm always amazed about 2 things. One is people talk about, well, nobody knows what a community means anymore. So there's this idea where community has become a bad name. Right? We give community a bad name. Well, community is not out there in space and we plug it. We create it. We work to create it. And don't expect everybody to be part of that. It is the goal that we bring people into the community. But that doesn't mean there's an absence of community. Community is not the problem. It's how community is lived and practiced. That is the problem. So we have to work with the notion of community and think critically about how we live and practice that community. And I think, to me, creating that community with acknowledging questions of difference, knowledge, resource, and power sharing is very, very important. Also, remember that our communities are sites and places of learning and healing, respect for diverse knowledges, as well as sharing and reciprocity. And you think about communities as both about differences and they are also about sameness. The point here is that sometimes just because I talk about shared experiences, so I may have shared experiences when it comes to questions of colonization, whether other Caribbean bodies or other Asian bodies or Latin American bodies. Saying that they are shared experiences doesn't mean those experiences are singular. No, they are shared, but they are not singular. There are points of connections. And sometimes we confuse talk or discourses of shared experiences as somebody is speaking about singular. No, I think shared experiences doesn't mean they are singular. It just means they are connecting links that we need to talk. And then as communities, when we come to the global space, we are confronted with broader questions and tensions, challenges as well as possibilities. Some of these broader questions, tensions, and challenges have to do with issues about migration, questions of family unification, and questions of community development. And I think we have to deal with that as part of the tensions and the possibilities of communities. And then the notion of difference. I think we have to separate colonial differencing. Because see, colonial differencing was about hierarchies. Colonial differencing was about, Albert Memmi talks about this. You create differences and then you assign values to those differences. And then on the basis of that, you deem it that these people are not worthy of A or B. I'm worthy of it because I'm more human. That is colonial differences. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about differences which says that if I walked in here and I said I don't see any color, that's an insult. Difference is not the problem. We need to be honest and talk about it. It is how we interpret those differences that is the problem. Differences are not a problem. It's how to have this color blind is so problematic, right? Because it allows privilege and power to match, right? So differences are not a problem. It is how we interpret and act with differences. So we have to distinguish between differences which we see as strengths and the colonial differences which are about power, about privilege, and it's about resource, right? There's the danger then of depoliticizing difference. Difference are about relations of power. Who constructs them? And through that construction, who gets what? And who is not part of the pack in that sense. The importance of also moving beyond mere acknowledging of difference to responding concretely to difference. So you come here and you say, oh, well, our community is so diverse. We have bodies coming from all over the globe. Well, what does that mean to concretely respond to that? So it's not just simply acknowledging that, but what does it mean to deal with issues of power, sharing, validation, and recognition? And also difference is about, the whole notion of difference is about recognizing the interstices of difference. The interstices of differences, as I said earlier on, is about the intersections of race, gender, class, disability. Edward Said, a long time ago, said, no one is one thing. No one is one thing. And now we rephrase that. No one has ever been one thing. We are multiplicated selves. We are race, we are gendered, we are class, we are sexualized. And so to talk about that interstices, because what it does is that it complicates our human subjectivities and identities. It also helps to subvert naturalizing and totalizing discourses. Then, of course, the power of the subaltern, Spivak, the power of the subaltern voice, and then the subaltern difference, which is about the authentication of voice and experience. When I speak about the authentication of voice, I don't use the authentication in terms of the purity of that voice or the voice is not contaminated. No, I'm talking about there is the relevance to hear that voice. In other words, there's the relevance to hear George's voice today. It is relevant because it has been absent from the dominant discourse. And we need to hear, and that's the authentication of that voice. So just don't simply say, well, I'm going to shut up because what he's saying, because you want to maintain the privilege. We need to authenticate, particularly those voices that haven't been heard. Those voices that have been maligned, those voices that have been negated, those voices that in many cases have been devalued. And of course, our experiences in that. And the last point in terms of that is the discourse of radical inclusion. What I said, which is that, to me, the principles of this rethinking of questions of diversity and difference is also to work with this notion of radical inclusion. That inclusion is about beginning anew, not simply about adding to what already exists. Because how do you hope to accomplish change when you add to what already exists? when what already exists is the source of the problem in the first place. So radical inclusion must work with multiple models of social justice. One of the models could be treating everybody the same. But that's the ideal one. That's where we want to go. But we are not there yet, right? We have to recognize and target our responses to differential groups because of the severity of issues, right? You cannot just simply say, so when somebody says, for example, that, well, if you don't treat everybody the same, that is not being justice. It's working with only one model of justice, which is treat everybody the same. That is the ideal one. The other models of justice, which is say, let's recognize history. Let's recognize the existing inequities and treat people according to that in order to address the uneven playing field. It's very, very important to deal with that. And of course, teaching to challenge our colonial investments. That teaching to challenge our colonial investments. I think from accommodation of the different others, part of the literature has been, oh, we need to accommodate the other. I don't want to be accommodated. It's not accommodation of the other. It's about congregations of power and resource, that I want to be able to live my dreams, my aspirations, that my identity needs to be recognized. My knowledge might count. It's not accommodating. That we extend the discussion beyond liberal pluralism or structural pluralism to what Nancy Fraser talks about, a politics of redistribution, which is about redistribution of the social goods and resources of society, and to challenge our regimes of citizenship, which I mentioned earlier on, that our regimes of citizenship, which is about that bifurcation between those citizens with rights as opposed to those subjects that need to be governed, right? To change our regimes of citizenship in that context. I want to end with just highlighting a couple of things briefly about what we call some of the strategies that I think we should be working with if we want to talk about education and inclusion. One is the whole area of policy. I think to me, policy is so important. I know people talk about, well, it has to start with the change of heart. I agree. But policy is very, very important because what? The problem with the policy is that sometimes they don't have teeth. That's the problem with the policy. They don't have teeth. That's the problem. It's not because the policy is not good. I think it's good to have the policies in place. And to bring a commitment, the policy will have clear guidelines. They will have well-defined equity standards. They have timelines. They have expectations. And they also have measures of accountability. It's not enough for the principal to tell me, or we have an anti-racist policy, or we have a policy on homophobia in my school. When nobody is held accountable when there are homophobic incidents in the school. So the question of accountability is, who do we hold accountable when the policy is not being implemented? When the policy is not put into action, that to me is the key that we need to agree with. And then there must be clear communication of the policy and its implications. Sometimes we can have the policy and nobody knows about it. It only sits on the shelves and people don't know about it in that context, right? Also putting specific equity initiatives in place, developing academic program initiatives that are not strictly subjected to economic arguments and rationalization. And I say this because of the universities in this particular where I am, right? Sometimes we talk about, let's introduce new courses that actually bring about change. And we will say, do you think the students will like it? Or would the students, okay, create and they will come. Let's have the courses and the students will come. That's what transformation has happened. When I first went into my institution, there are certain courses that were not on the books. We started having those courses around race, anti-racism, and all of a sudden, certain bodies started showing up because they saw the place as welcoming. It dealt with some of the issues that they are concerned with. So let us create, and they will come. Wherever we find ourselves, if we want change, let us create, and people will come. To integrate anti-racist, anti-colonial, indigenous literatures into the school curriculum, pursuing, obviously, it's not enough to have the curriculum without reviewing curriculum annually, to see the limitations, to see the negations, the absences. It's always being constant on your toes. And developing proactive strategies for recruitment, whether the different bodies that I spoke earlier on. And of course, questions of pedagogy, which we've talked about, but I think to me, literacy education and decolonization is about having and thinking through multiple pedagogies and instruction. So we diversify the curriculum, which is beyond text, beyond pedagogy, to talk about infusions of multiple teaching methodologies, indigenous pedagogies and epistemologies. Also, application of indigenous and Aboriginal initiatives to support critical understandings of indigenous and Canadian history, and a consideration of more dialogical curriculum creation that involves our students, it involves educators, and involves our local communities in that exercise. And then, of course, evaluation assessments. I think we still have to deal with the still Eurocentric or Euro-centered evaluation methods. and to begin to consider issues about orality, right? Orality as equal medium to written tests, giving students opportunity to submit assignments orally. Also, not limiting text to only academic projects, but also to include community-based events as sites of learning. Sometimes people learn more when they go into the communities and work with people rather than read the text. And then encouraging students to respond or to present non-traditional papers through art-based multimedia and other opportunities to be creative and to think outside the box. It's all a recognition and honor of multiple ways of knowing and being. So to conclude, 2 thoughts in conclusion, that I think as we move forward, an important challenge will be how literacy education helps address colonial hierarchies of schooling. And by colonial hierarchies of schooling, I'm talking about whose knowledge counts, whose experiences count, whose histories count, whose ideas are validated, whose identities are legitimized, right? As well as internalized colonial differences and the ongoing depolarization of difference and social inclusion. I think there's an urgency of nurturing a political epistemic potential. I call those of us here as that potential, that political epistemic potential for educational change. And the process of change lies foremost in bringing literacy education and indigenous knowledges together. So wherever you are, I know you've been doing the work. Wherever you are, you've been doing the work. But please, we should all always remember that there is a sensation of moving while standing still. So just don't stand there. Don't just be here. Don't just stand there. Thank you.